Okay, and now to our next speaker is Charles Justin. Charles is an architect. He is past president of the Jewish Museum of Australia. He and his wife Lee are passionate collectors of contemporary art for over 40 years, with a particular interest in digital artworks. In 2016, Charles and Lee opened the Justin Art House Museum, a privately funded, not-for-profit house museum open to the public. Charles is currently chair of the Melbourne Art Foundation. Can you please welcome up to the podium, Charles?
Thank you, MaryJo, for that introduction, and also ACMI for inviting me to speak at this symposium. I do have a confession to make. In spite of the fact that we are sort of enthusiastic collectors of digital art, Leah and I are what I would classify as technological Luddites. Each of us barely know how to operate a computer, and so you can imagine with what you've heard today, the challenges that we face dealing with this art form. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give you a bit of an introduction to what JAM is about, to sort of contextualise what we do. And then I'd talk about an exhibition we had last year of our digital collection and some of the experiences we had there. And then I'll talk specifically about a few of the works and some of the challenges that we had. House museums are a sort of genre of private museums. The thing about private museums is that they essentially display private collections, and generally what drives collectors to have private museums is they want to share their collection with the public. The difference between a house museum is that the collectors are actually living in the museum. So visitors have the experience of not only seeing the collection but also seeing how the collectors live with their art. When we set up JAM, we're a pretty small museum. I think our museum would actually fit into the cloakroom of the NGV, and we probably run on a budget which is equivalent to their petty cash budget. And so how to vision the museum was something that we sort of thought about, and one of the things we determined is we wanted to provide our visitors a sort of very personal and intimate experience. So we have small groups coming. We have 2 exhibitions a year. One exhibition is from our collection and the other one is from outside. Leah and I personally conduct every tour or visit, and we have 2 a week for the 3 months that each exhibition is on. And our tours are interactive. So one of the things we do is we engage our audience in the actual viewing of the exhibition. And one of the things we try and do, because most of our visitors are actually non-art people, is actually to demystify contemporary art and to help our visitors develop a sort of visual literacy as to how to sort of understand the art. So we actually, what we call believers in the slow art movement, sort of equivalent to what the slow food movement is like. And so that's a slide of one of the tours. The other thing, we also have a public program, and and this is an example of 3 of our digital artists who spoke about their practices, and what was amazing was how different their practices were. And the one on the left there is Daniel Crooks, who's probably one of the premium video artists in Australia, and he talked about the idea of taking a block of code and just sculpting it the way a sculptor would sculpt a block of marble. And he does wonderful work. We then also invite people into our apartment where we have a hang of our own personal collection, and we provide refreshments. And one of the things we're trying to do, similar to what Kalani was talking about, is create this sort of salon atmosphere where people sort of feel comfortable that they can sort of talk about the art, and people can go into all our rooms and see how we actually live with our art. So this is the digital exhibition that we had. We had about 40 works on display, and it was quite a wide spectrum of works, including video work, also digital work, computer-generated work, augmented photography, works which were appropriated, quite a diverse range of work. One of the good things is that coming to a private collection is generally what you see is art that you don't necessarily see in public institutions. And in our case, it's even more so because we principally collect emerging artists. So we're also not what is termed a white box gallery. So we painted the walls in our gallery bright pink because that was a beautiful backdrop to all the digital works. And one of the challenges that we had is that in the sort of 15 years we've been collecting digital art, the artworks has been supplied to us in various formats ranging from CDs and DVDs and hard drives and USB sticks. And one of the problems we found is that the manner in which the videos were supplied were not actually compatible with the TVs which we wanted to display. So we actually had to get the artists to reformat the artworks so we could actually display them. And that raises the question, is does that materially alter the integrity of the artwork? The other thing we do also is we appoint writers to write critical essays on our exhibitions, and we actually appoint people from outside the art world. We actually prefer people to come from outside the art world who are actually expert in the theme that we wish to explore. And the theme for our digital exhibition was called The World of Alternate Realities, because we also wanted to explore how in the digital world information was being manipulated in such a way that it represented something other than the reality of that work. So we asked Tim Flannery, who is a well-known scientist and conservationist, writer and activist and academic, and what he did is he actually wrote about how the digital, or the role that digital played in the natural world versus the way that digital is actually playing out in the man-made world. And it's a beautiful essay. It's on our website. You're welcome to read it. And one thing he did mention, which I thought was a wonderful metaphor, was the role of DNA. He pointed out that DNA sort of stores the sort of key information that's required for the generation of life. And in fact, it's such an effective method of storage that they had experiments in 2013 where they actually downloaded 5 million bits of information onto a piece of DNA and retrieved it. And this was both audio and video information. But he also made the point that DNA in its own right does not constitute life. You need agency to convert the DNA into life. And I thought that was a wonderful metaphor because that's the role that the artists have. Artists are the people who actually take information, they take technology, and that's what they make the artwork out of, right? And you need that agency. So there is this distinction. And from what we've heard today, it's important to remember that. So the artwork is not the data, and it's not the hardware, it's not the technology, it's actually what the artwork is intended to be. It's the sort of the intellectual component of what constitutes the artwork. Now, this is a work that we acquired very early on by Stephen Haley. Now, Stephen has a very interesting practice. He actually buys digital files off the internet. These are 3D files which actually been created for the gaming industry. And he actually buys them and actually uses those files to actually create his artworks. And now one thing I'm actually too afraid to ask him is whether he's actually had copyright clearance to actually include those in his artworks. And it is an issue because I'm not particularly worried about it because that work's only worth a few $1,000s. But if it's worth billions of dollars, it could just change the whole foundation of the approach to copyright. And it reminds me of a recent experience I read about where tattoo artists are actually suing celebrities for copyright infringement because of the tattoos on their bodies, which are actually part of their public personality. And they've been successful. So it's interesting that these unexpected consequences of things that are happening. I had another experience with this work. We were a few years ago in Berlin, and we actually saw this work in a shop being sold in a actually different edition to what we bought. We bought a limited edition, and this is a whole new edition. And to say that I was pissed off was an understatement. So when I confronted Stephen when we came back, he explained to me that in fact it was a different work because the size of the work was different, and also the paper on which it was printed was different, which I subsequently found out that he was correct. From a legal point of view, it was a different artwork. And then we had a debate about the sort of distinction between what's legal and what's ethical, all right? Now this is what the government is spending millions of dollars now in the Banking Royal Commission to make that distinction. But it is an issue. Now, Stephen and I were good mates, and we sort of came to understanding. But what it does raise the issue is that at the end of the day, we as collectors only have a copy of the work, right? Now that copy is identical to the original, but in fact the artist retains the original, and we have no control over what the artist does with that original work. And the way the artist treats that original work could have some impact on the work in our collection. This is another work we had on display by Gordon Monroe. Now, Gordon's an interesting guy. He's actually a mathematician by profession, and he's become an artist in his retirement. And we fell in love with this work because what Gordon does, he actually develops mathematical algorithms which actually create the art. He doesn't create the art, the algorithm creates the art. So one of the questions we posed to our visitors was, who is the artist? Is it Gordon or is it the algorithm, right? Now, most people, of course, agreed that it was Gordon who was the artist. But then I sort of made the point that all the digital art that we're showing in our exhibition and what exists today is actually at the infancy of digital art. We're the sort of Model T forward of what digital art could be. What's going to happen in 5 or 10 years where artificial intelligence gets to the point where it's self-learning and can actually make decisions which are quite conscious, and it then creates the art. Who's in fact the artist then? And it reminds me of what I read recently, and this is within artificial intelligence today, that they actually fed in all of Mozart's work into a machine, and the artificial intelligence actually learnt the style and method of Mozart composing, and they composed new works, Mozart style, to the point where authorities on Mozart's music couldn't tell the difference between these new works. So it is a bit scary with regard to the whole concept of what is in fact going to be original or not. This is the last work that I'll talk about, and this is a work by Michael Candy, and this work, as you can see, has been on the promotion of that ACMI used for this symposium. Michael's a young artist who lives in the back blocks of the Gold Coast. He supports himself by living on the dole, and he's a genius. In fact, Peter Hill, who's a good friend of mine, who's a sort of very renowned critic and curator, says that Michael is one of the best artists he's seen in the last 10 years. So this is Michael actually getting the work called the digital empathy device, getting it working. And so it's in 2 parts. You can see it's that sculpture with that sort of mechanical device at the top, and behind that is a TV. And the TV is actually a video record of him actually creating and installing this work in Paris. And this is a photograph of him in his hotel room in Paris actually creating this device. And he was terrified that he would be picked up. What he did, he goes to Paris, he buys the components from a $2 shop or from a hardware store to put together this device. And this device is exactly the same technology that's used for the making of roadside bombs. And so what he was terrified about was that if he was busted, that they would actually arrest him for being a terrorist. And what this device does is it works the same way, and it's actually connected to a website called LiveMap. What LiveMap does is it actually collects social information, you know, like Facebook posts, Twitter posts, iPhone photographs, videos of incidents that are happening in hotspots around the world. This is like Iraq, in Syria, Kosovo, in Palestine, and this is sort of in real time. And what Michael's device does, it is connected to this website, and every time there's a major incident, either a roadside bomb or an air raid or a suicide bomb, the signal is picked up by the device, and 2 tears come down the face of that sculpture. So what happens is, instead of that technology actually blowing something up, what that technology is doing is crying every time that happens, right? It's a very powerful work, and what the video actually is a record of him doing that. Now, what he did in Paris was that he actually made this device and actually planted it on the head of the Statue of Liberty in Republic Square. And so every time an incident happened in Syria, tears would come down the face. Now, from a conservation point of view, you can sort of start to surmise some of the challenges of this work. First of all, from a technological point of view, the mechanisms made for roadside bombs are not designed for longevity, right? So this device broke down a lot of times, didn't work all that long, right? The other thing was that Syria is in a different time zone to when we were running our tours, right? So when we had tours, nothing was happening. So I did suggest, well, I couldn't actually send an email to ISIS to actually do something while our tour program's on for this tour. But it did work, because I know next morning I'd come down and there was a puddle of water at the bottom of the sculpture, right? But the other problems are even more manifest themselves, because what is powerful about this work is it's actually based in real time on real events. You know, like most traditional art works are historic. You know, they're created at a certain point in time, but this one's actually connected to real time and real events. However, it is actually dependent on third-party organisations. So it's dependent on the war in Syria. What happens when the war in Syria finishes? Okay, we could switch it to another hotspot, but then it becomes a different artwork. What happens if LiveMap is no longer operational? What happens when the phone, which is embedded in the mechanism to make this artwork operate, when that's no longer in business, right? So I've sort of come to the conclusion that in some ways the chances of this work actually lasting long term are pretty slim, and I really regard it as a temporal artwork. And what I'll be relying on is the video, which is the record of the history of this work, as being the extant artwork. And you can understand from what we've seen before today how complex some of these works can be and the challenges that we have. So to finish off, I thought I would, this is a sort of detailed view. You can see on the back and all the syringes. So I'll finish off with an ad. This is an ad for our current exhibition. This is a photography exhibition, and it's a very immersive experience. So we've used technology here today, but this is digital photos shown on both photographs and screens. But as I said, the exhibitions that we curate are based around ideas. So the sort of idea that we're trying to explore through this exhibition is the role that imagery is playing today. Because today, I think about 1 billion images are downloaded from smartphones every day. To the point where images are almost starting to replace text as a primary form of communication, but more so as a primary form of the way human beings actually express themselves and define themselves. So thank you very much.
And again, I'll invite Charles to take a seat, and we'll just start off with a few questions about preserving the near future from a private collector's perspective. So I guess firstly we have to say thank you for sharing an incredible private collection with the public. I'm always very grateful when people who get to live with this beautiful art open those opportunities up to a wider public. I think that should be at least recognised. I'm very interested, again, I guess preserving the new future as the theme here, and for those that are sort of more from an institutional background, most of our day is actually spent negotiating what fundamentally are legal acts that set up our organisations to collect, present, preserve this art. And that's where we're always negotiating what that means, I guess, within as an asset, as a state collection asset, which are governed by audits. Victorian Auditor General's Office always wants to know, how much has been conserved or what's been treated, how much has been on display. I mean, the beauty of a private collection is you get to determine what that is all about. So I'm kind of interested, over that 40 years, you've mentioned that the this time-based media art is sort of initiated this need to preserve so that you could re-display it. I guess, how does preservation sit within your collection? Is it just the need to get things on display? And you've also sort of touched on that idea that there are some things you're actually happy to allow to go into that obsolescence, to allow their sense to that, I guess, that significance to no longer exist in that sort of form.
Well, I suppose one of the advantages I have is I'm so much older than all the artists I collect, so I'm sort of relying on them to be the preservers of the work. So if something goes wrong, I can always go back to the artists. But look, we don't have the resources of a public institution. And also the other thing is that the art we collect is not sort of super valuable, and which doesn't in any way diminish their value to us. But we do a reasonable job in trying to protect it and preserve it and to catalogue it and have it ready to be displayed. So we sort of say we probably sit somewhere between a sort of commercial gallery and a public institution.
Fantastic. And just having a look up into the crowd if there are any hands. I guess the other thing too is amazing that you actually lead these tours and you open up those discussions with people coming in to see these sorts of collections. Do people ask those discussions about preservation? Does that sort of click with the public that this is actually a stewardship process as well?
Look, I think the public have actually a greater problem with regard to dealing with digital works altogether. So a lot of the questions we got during our exhibition, for instance, is like, how does it work? Because like a copy is identical to the original, and so they couldn't get a handle on how it worked, and like the economics and also the issue of what is the original and authentication and things like this. And essentially my explanation was, look, it's not dissimilar to the way you buy limited edition prints. You buy a limited edition, and at the end of the day, you have a piece of paper saying that you've bought one of the original copies, right? And I said one of the ironies is, in fact, that if one of the works that is in your collection goes viral, and everyone around the world's familiar with it, and you own one of the originals, in fact, your value will go up. So it's sort of almost counterintuitive. And what's important, I think, is to make sure that you've got the paperwork in place to ensure that you've probably secured the provenance of the work that's in your collection. So that's one of the problems that people had, and they just couldn't get their head around it. And again, I think that one of the views I have is that sort of traditional art is pretty much quite it hasn't been disrupted yet. I think people are sort of collecting art the way they did thousands of years ago. And I can imagine one day, especially with digital art, that people won't be buying it, they'll be streaming it, the way that movies and televisions have been streamed, and you can have your TV set up in your house, and you can show video art, and you can have a huge library of video art. You can change it all the time. You don't have to particularly own it. You can have the art experience. Because at the end of the day, what's important is not the art itself, it's actually the experience that you obtain from it. And it doesn't mean you have to own it. And there's a whole new potential out there. And in fact, the way we set up at home at the moment is we've got all our videos actually sitting on our central computer, and it's all web connected to all the 3 TVs that we have in our house. So I can go to any one of our TVs and I can call up any of the videos and just show it. And so, and I can just change them whenever I want to, like you do your TV programs. And that's just standard technology. That's nothing special that I set up. That's just what you can do with a smart TV. And I think that once the public resistance to sort of digital art sort of breaks down a bit and people become more familiar, I think all these opportunities will arise, and it could be terrific because and one of the reasons we're attracted to video art is that from an experiential point of view, it's that much richer. It's just like if you look at a painting, okay, painting's fantastic, but it doesn't move and it doesn't have sound and it doesn't have all those other qualities that go with it. So you can get a much richer experience from it, and then on top of that, you've got the potential of portability and exchange and all those things that come with digital art. So I think the future could be quite exciting.
That kind of brings up, I guess, a few things for me with the idea of, you mentioned authenticity, and that's something that we constantly always skirt about, I guess, around in arts and what the authentic means in this process. And but then I think that authenticity is perhaps layered. The talks this morning sort of, was it Wakun's, the comment that you're sharing the surface, but there's actually sort of something below that as well that's maybe that richer history, the provenance, the artwork in a particular point in time and the social layers related to that. As we're going through this idea of iterations, you mentioned documenting or allowing some things of that, I guess, that lower level experience to sort of go whilst maintaining some of those, the visual of it. And that's a resource need that everyone's sort of having to meet, even with the larger institutions, is a challenge, what to let go of and what to retain.
Yeah, but I think that applies equally to whether it's a painting or a digital work.
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't think there's much different there. For instance, if streaming came on board, right, you wouldn't have to worry about the whole issue of conservation, because that would be somebody else's problem, right? So,
I guess in terms of fidelity of what the artist intent of some things. No, I agree. There's the.
But the thing is, the whole thing with digital, and I think that one of the things that we try to demonstrate through our exhibition is that the digital as a whole makes the whole issue of authenticity challenging, because in the digital world, it is just so easy to manipulate and change things, right? Like a lot of works that we had, for instance, dealt with appropriation. People are actually using other images as a foundational part of their work, right? We had one work, for instance, where someone had, one of the artists had downloaded one of the maps from Google and actually played around with the shapes, and he sort of turned all the freeways into a sort of clover leaf, and it ended up looking like a garden from Versailles, right? And in fact, his practice, although he's a photographer, he never uses his own photographs in his practice. He only uses appropriated images. Well, that's not new. Warhol did it. Everyone did it. But with digital, it's just that much easier to download an image from somewhere, or to copy an image from somewhere and integrate it into your work. The complexities that would raise with regard to authenticity are immense, and I'm sure it would happen in particular with regard to certain personalities and what the work would end up being of value. Like no one's going to see a work that's a few $1,000s, but if it's worth sort of 20 million, then all of a sudden it's a different ball game, isn't it? So that's what happens. But within the digital world, there is so much scope for playing with authenticity.
It is. Were there any questions from the audience?
Thanks, Charles. That's fascinating. One of the questions I've got is, where does this fit within a community of collectors? So do you have a strong community that you're competing with for works? Do you feel that there's a cohort that you can talk to? Are you being petitioned, like places like the National Gallery, for use of your works in exhibitions? In that kind of broader ecosystem of collecting and exhibition and sale and all the rest of it, where do you think your collecting practice currently fits?
Well, the thing is, from a critical point of view, probably low down the scale. I mean, we have some terrific artists, and but because we collect a lot of emerging artists, we sort of not being tapped on the shoulder by major institutions to borrow our works. But on the other hand, we quite enjoy that because the people who come to our museum get to see these works, which they probably wouldn't see anywhere else. And I think one of the propositions we're trying to present to the general public who visit us is that you don't need to buy well-known artists to surround yourself with fantastic art. And in fact, the art that we buy is very affordable. And look, within our collection, we also have some well-known artists. And one thing we don't do is we don't have labels next to our work. And we do that purposely, and we mix it up. So we have a emerging artist right now next door to a well-known artist, and sometimes the visitors can't tell who's who, and they'll think, because they recognise some of the artists, that the emerging artist is somebody else, and we have to correct them and say no. And so what we want them to do is actually to look at the art and not look at the name, and to and judge it on its own merits. But we do keep in touch with other collectors. We don't see them as competitors. We see them as colleagues. And in fact, one of the mandates that we have at JAM is for every second exhibition which we do from outside. Did I mention that? One is from our collection, one's from outside. The ones from outside is we have a commitment to unlocking other private collectors. Because the reality is most art is in private hands and the public doesn't get to see them. And so we see ourselves as tapping them on the shoulder and sort of say, look, let's have an exhibition on your work and let the public have access to it. And so we had one last year, I think it was, collectors from Canberra. Next year we're having another one from Melbourne who has a major collection of fantastic art. And so not only do we unlock the collection, but then we work with the collector to have a thematically curated exhibition based on their collection. So we want the collection not only come and look at me, but we want that collection to say something about. And so the next exhibition, for instance, is he's got a very strong collection in major Indigenous art together with other non-Indigenous artists, and I think the working title at the moment is Country. So what we want to explore is identity through art, through the artwork. But that only happens through the sort of relationships we've built up with other collectors, and some of which has occurred through JAM.
Any other questions? One more. I think that will be the last one before we throw to a break.
Hi, just a quick question about tech support. Sorry, I'm a conservator, so that's my thing. You seem to have a lot of personal association with the artists you collect, which is really great. As part of the acquisition process, do you negotiate sort of future tech support, or do you discuss migration in the future? And have you had any artists that have just refused to be involved in that side of things? They're just going to sell you the edition of the work and then that's it?
Well, I don't think we've ever dealt with artists directly. We generally deal through galleries. Although Michael Candy's work we bought at Not Fair, we dealt directly with him. We've had no pushback from artists. So generally what we've found with artists is that they are sort of very enthusiastic to be involved. And with artists it varies as to how anal they are with regard to their work, you know, and some can be super anal and some can be really relaxed. So it's important to respect the sort of wishes of the artists. So what we try to do is to accommodate them, but on the other hand, if they're being ridiculously unreasonable, we'll push back on that as well. So at the end of the day, it always becomes a negotiation. But we're big believers that all the stakeholders need to be happy with regard to what we do, and so it all comes down to, I think, constructive negotiation.
Fantastic. We'll stop it there for a 10-minute break, if we can be back in 10 minutes, but can we all say thank you to Charles for having a talk?